Lockie says, with programmed training sessions, how many of them should you be treating like competition? Okay, so what we're talking about here is trying to move a competition setting into training. Should you be training like you compete effectively is the question here. So there is a difference between training and competition. The aim of training is to make you better. The aim of competition is to be better, is to express the training that you've done. Now, if you treat every single session in training like it's a competition, you're going to suffer burnout. There's going to be a mental burnout because of the amount of stress, anxiety that you're placing on yourself throughout the events and throughout your training. And there's also going to be a physical burnout as well, because there is just an extra yard of pace, an extra couple of percent that we find in competition, which you wouldn't normally find in training. And that's okay, that's a good thing. Because there are so many skills and competencies and movements that we are required to perform from different modes, different time domains, we do have to train with a certain amount of volume. We're not in a very small and a narrow band of competencies. It is quite broad. So because of that, we have to train with volume. And if you're training with that volume, as well as super high competition intensity all the time, it's going to cause you these mental and physical burnout problems. So we need some volume to touch on everything that we need to touch on. And volume and intensity tend to be inversely correlated. One goes up, the other comes down. So it's okay for intensity to come down slightly to be able to hit that volume of training that is required. I would say probably maximum once a fortnight you should be hitting a competition intensity in training. So pick and choose sessions which are going to be effective, which will allow you to train your competition craft, and choose those and really focus on them as maybe in a competition state. Some reasons why, or some situations when you should train like you would compete. Firstly, in terms of pacing. So you should always strategize in your training like you would compete. And you're doing this because you need to practice the skill and the self-awareness of if I train like this, if I strategize like this is my end result. You don't want to not strategize in training and then strategize in competition with that lack of awareness of what you're actually able to do and the results and outcome of that training strategy. So always strategize in training like you would in competition. The second reason that you should train like you would plan to compete would be in your pre-lifting routines. So let's say you're about to step up and hit a snatch, be it 20 kilos in your warm-up or 120 kilos if you're going for a max. You should have the same pre-lift routine. Just like a basketballer bouncing the ball a certain number of times, a swimmer slapping themselves on the back 5 times, a tennis player bouncing the ball a certain number of times before each serve, you should start to develop these routines. And this will allow a consistency of performance, a checklist of sorts that will allow you to then get a predictable outcome to that skill. So always practice those pre-lift, those pre-event routines in training so you can start to develop them. You can train like you would compete if the session you're doing has a low neuromuscular load. So basically this means if it's a session that leaves you feeling really beat down and exhausted and you're still feeling it a couple of days later, maybe don't hit competition intensity. But if it's something short, fast and light, maybe not super high rep, where the focus maybe is more on cardiorespiratory endurance or speed development or movement speed, yes, you can hit those with a higher intensity. So that leads us into when would you train differently? When would you train in a different intensity, a different style than you would compete in? Well, if low neuromuscular load, that effect that the exercise has on your body is going to be okay to do in training, high neuromuscular load is not. So if there's a session that leaves you feeling like you've been hit by a truck, really beat down, that takes a lot of time to recover from, you would drop the intensity of that in training. Again, otherwise we just can't get the volume we need to touch on all the competencies that we are required to develop. So yes, okay to drop the intensity in training because it's just not sustainable, as we've talked about. When would you not train like you compete? In technical movements where maybe you're going to failure. So if you know that your movement patterns start to fall apart at very heavy loads, then you would avoid those very heavy loads. I'd rather you hit 10 beautiful reps at 95% than miss a whole bunch going for a PB at 101 and you start to hit technical failure as well as actual failure. So your form starts to fall apart. So really good movement patterns in training. This is going to allow you then to increase that 101% because of the work that you're doing in training. Maybe an event comes around and you say, hey, I want to win this, you go all out. Maybe your technique falls apart. It's not ideal, but the aim here is just to lift as much as you can, not to look pretty. Now, often looking pretty will allow you to lift as much as you can, but not always the case. So this brings me to this concept of reps for quality in training. So in training, you will use a technique that you're not necessarily going to use in competition, but which will help with competition, which is the whole aim of this. You will judge the completion of reps, not just based on some arbitrary start and end point. So an air squat isn't just hips and knees open, hip crease below the knee, hips and knees open, but a determinant of what actually happens in between those points. What does it look like? Are there some points of performance that we can have here, which are going to help to make sure that that movement is done with quality? Because if we think of this as a Venn diagram where we have efficiency, safety, speed, strength, the top athletes will have these circles overlapping perfectly. The efficient technique will be the fast technique, will be the strong technique, will be the safe technique. They're all the same thing. So you need to develop that in training. Again, in competitions, as we push the margins of our ability and go close to our breaking point, there is going to be some fall apart in your technique and your movement patterns. But in training, make sure that the efficiency, the movement quality is part of the criteria for an effective completion of that rep. It's not just about getting it done, it's about getting it done well. And in training, perfect time to practice that.